the storms of life are raging, Lord, stand by me. When the current pulls me under, Lord, stand by me. When the rising waters toss me like a ship upon the sea, you who rule the wind and water, Lord, stand by me. In the midst of persecution, Lord, stand by me. When the enemies surround me, Lord, stand by me. When the tyrant wields his terror and the armies wage their might, when the darkness overwhelms me, Lord, stand by me. Stand by me, stand by me, lift me up from the restless sea. When I am lost, when love can't be found, when no one cares, Lord, stand by me. Stand by me, stand by me, lift me up from the restless sea. When I am lost, when love can't be found, when no one cares, Lord, stand by me. 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 Lift me up from the restless sea. When I am lost, when love can't be found,
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our Catholics at Home podcast, where we come to you every Saturday morning at 10:30 a.m. We bring you a variety of conversations, from interesting ones, church-related, life-related, also, what's happening in the country too. We have different conversations every Saturday morning, and we'd like to welcome you to this episode. And so if you're joining us for the very first time, welcome to this small little online community that meets every Saturday morning to be able to reflect, to share, and also to be able to grow in our faith. Now, for those of you who have been following us, now today we are, I think, episode 72, almost 18 months since we started. You will always see me coming on later after our hosts have introduced the show. Well, today I'm going solo. Rather, I'm flying solo. Well, the other hosts are not available, so I'm going to be your host. I'm going to be in this interesting conversation that we have this morning, and also to just help us to understand better our faith, our church, our spirituality, especially in a time like this when we are all still fighting this pandemic. As we talked about a week ago, we are still in the midst of a health crisis, a political crisis, an economic crisis. But one thing we remember that God is with us, and that's the hope that we have, that we know that the light at the end of the tunnel is coming to us very soon. And so, wherever you are tuning in from this morning, let's give thanks to God for this opportunity to be gathered together, to be able to have this conversation. Now, I must tell you on the onset that this conversation is being recorded and it's not being broadcasted live as we usually do on a Saturday morning, simply because the guest that we have this morning lives in New York, and then there is a 12-hour difference. And if we were doing it live at 10:30 in the morning on a Saturday morning, it would be 10:30 p.m. for our guests at night, and that's a bit late in the night to have a conversation. And so this conversation is going to be pre-recorded and being broadcasted to you. Nevertheless, I'm sure it'll be an interesting conversation, and I'm sure you know who our guest is this morning or today. It's Father James Martin, an author, a Jesuit priest who's written quite a bit. Let's bring in Father James into this conversation. Hi, James. I think you are muted. So, all right. Okay, we got you in.
I would say good morning. How are you?
I'm very good.
Good.
And it's morning for you now?
It is. It is about almost 10 o'clock in the morning here in New York City.
All right. James, thank you very much for taking time to be with us on this podcast, this conversation. I know you have a very busy schedule. When you come up to the weekend, I know that you do your Sunday reflections and many other things that you do online and offline too. But thank you very much for taking time to be with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, just before we started, you had an interesting story about Malaysia. About, though you had not been to Malaysia, but you were saying something about your dad having been in Malaysia. So you have some memory, or at least you've heard the name Malaysia being mentioned before in your household.
Absolutely. My father worked for a pharmaceutical firm called Wyeth, which is still around. And this would have been the early 60s, mid 60s, late 60s, early 70s. He was responsible for Southeast Asia and Japan. And so he would travel to Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur a lot. He would travel to Indonesia, Japan, and really went all over the place. And so I knew all about Malaysia. We got coins from Malaysia and dollar bills, or rather, currency from Malaysia. So absolutely. And so I'm one of these days I think I'll go to that part of the world and see what my dad was writing home about. Now remember, this is before, obviously way before email, or even we couldn't call him. So these are postcards and letters, and so it's fun to sort of reconnect with that part of my life.
Do you have any of those postcards still from Malaysia? One day we should have a look at that. What was it like?
I'm sure that my mom still has them. He would also go to Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. He was all over the place. And, at the time, he would go away for 3 or 4 months because, in the 60s, when you flew over there, you couldn't just fly back. And when you were over there, he had to do all of his business. So he would be away from our house for 3 or 4 months, and we'd get these really interesting letters and postcards, and it's kind of exciting.
Well, letters and postcards are a little bit now, out of fashion, isn't it? We just, text messages are the most common things that we do today. James, just, for a lot of people, I know they read, you have written quite a bit. But at least for those who have not heard of you in this part of the world, I'm sure there are few and far apart who have not heard about you. Maybe a little bit about yourself. I mean, where do you come from, James? I mean, originally.
Sure. So I'm from Philadelphia, which is on the East Coast of the United States. That's where I grew up with my dad and my mom and my sister. I didn't have a particularly super religious upbringing. I went to public high schools, and I went to the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business. I studied finance. I worked for 6 years with General Electric, and then I entered the Jesuits in 1988. I won't tell you all of my training. Part of it was overseas in East Africa with working with refugees. And then in 1999, I was ordained a Jesuit priest, and I've been working ever since at America Magazine, which is a Catholic magazine. And I write mainly on spirituality and religion. And I do a lot of work on social media. And I'm also in 2017, the Holy Father appointed me as a consultor to the Dicastery for communication in the Vatican, which has been very interesting. So I'm really, so that's what I do. Mainly I write. That's my main apostolate, in addition to the other priestly, more sacramental things that I do, like, celebrating mass and baptisms and funerals and weddings like every other priest.
You say you write. Do you have track of how many articles, how many books have you written?
It's funny. People ask me that, and I think the number of books I'm looking on my shelf, probably about 15 or 20. I'm not sure. And it's a little vague because some of them are edited books. So, I don't know if they really count. Articles, boy, I don't know. I've been doing it for 20 years, so probably a few hundred. I can't keep track. Sometimes like a feast day will come up, like a feast of, today's where we are is the Feast of St. Bernard. And someone will say, oh, I really liked your article in St. Bernard. And I said, where did you see that? And it turns out it's from 15 years ago. I can't even remember.
That's right. You mentioned, James, that in terms of education, you went to Wharton Business School. Now, that's a famous business school. I guess you had your career path all planned out well. What made you choose this path now? Right.
Well, we're speaking about vocation today. I was very much on that career path of being a person in business. And of course, as many of the people who are watching know, business is a real vocation for so many people. I mean, I would think a lot of people watching are in business in some way. And yet it didn't seem like it was for me. I studied business and enjoyed studying finance. But after 5 or 6 years at GE, I thought this isn't for me. But I really couldn't see a way out. No one had really asked me the kind of questions that we ask in the church, which is, what are you meant for? What does God intend for you? What is your vocation? At Wharton, it was basically, what can get you the best job, the most money, which, people need to live and earn a living. Anyway, one night I came home and turned on the TV and saw a documentary about Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk. And it was so interesting that I went out and purchased his book, The Seven-Story Mountain, which is really terrific. And that was sufficiently interesting enough to lead me to read the whole book. And that got me started about thinking about the priesthood. And I ended up speaking to a local priest in our parish where I was at the time. And he said, well, you should talk to the diocesan vocation office. And then he said, by the way, or as an aside, he said, you might want to talk to the Jesuits, because I was near a Jesuit university. And that's how that happened. So it was it was Providence, of course. And then I met the Jesuits and really never looked back.
Wow. But, in preparing for this conversation, James, I mean, I've read some of your books, but didn't know much about your life. But you seem to have had also a little role to play in a movie. How did that happen? I mean, was it before you joined the Jesuits or after?
No, it's pretty funny. I guess you're talking about The Irishman, the Martin
That's right.
Scorsese.
That's
Yeah.
right. Martin
So
Scorsese.
I had, a little closer to where you are. I had worked with Martin Scorsese on a film called Silence about 17th century Jesuit missionaries in Japan, which was starred Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver and Liam Neeson. It's quite good. It's based on a novel, I'm sure you know, by Shusaku Endo. And I got to know Martin Scorsese, and his next film was called The Irishman, which came out with Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci and a few other people. And he asked me, like he did on Silence, to be kind of a technical advisor, more of a theological advisor. And I was helping him with different parts of the movie that had to do with the church, mainly sacraments. So they had a baptism, a wedding, and a funeral in the movie. And during the baptism, he said, "Would you like to be the priest?" I said, "Sure. I don't need too much encouragement to be in a Martin Scorsese movie. That sounds like fun." And funny enough, I wasn't really nervous because, like you, Father, I've done so many baptisms. It was like a regular baptism. I just, they brought the kid over to me, and it was a real child. It was in Latin, which I normally don't do baptisms in Latin. But they all said, "Oh, you look very natural doing it." I said, "Well, I do baptisms all the time." So it was a lot of fun. And my friends all laughed when they saw me on the screen,
So were you ever nominated for a best supporting actor of some sort?
Sadly, no, I was overlooked. I was overlooked by the Academy. But funny enough, I get residual checks. I got, which, I take a vow of poverty, so I turn it into my community. But I get checks, from the movie, which is very funny.
But you also have a little role in Comedy Central, I hear. So you quite a different things that you have done.
Yeah. I helped out on the Stephen Colbert show. I was on the old show, the Colbert Show, and I've been on his late night show. Part of it, Father, is it's just a function of being in New York City. Really, there's so many entertainers and media types around, and I also work at a magazine, and so you're close by, and so they're happy to kind of pull you in. And I always say, my rule is I always say yes, unless it's really something offensive, but because you can always make something better in terms of the church. And if they're trying to portray the church in some way, even if it's not such a great movie or not such a great TV show, you can always make it less bad.
That's right.
And you can, I help them by helping them understand how the church works. And, I feel that the media helps the church if we can put a good face on the church, and it's a great tool for evangelization. So I almost always say yes to these things.
But I mean, talking about Comedy Central, I also know that, you have a good sense of humor, isn't it? I mean, in one of the early books that you wrote, Between Heaven and Mirth, about humor in the life of church men and women, of course, and spirituality too. And I think Pope Francis had mentioned something. We don't have enough humor in consecrated men and women. We need to be a bit more. And I remember reading this particular line in the book. I don't know if you remember. You've written so much. Sometimes it's good to laugh at oneself. And you talk about the story about you trying to learn Swahili.
I was in. Many stories about that. I worked for 2 years with refugees in East Africa, and it's kind of a funny story. I think the one I told in the book, in Swahili, I'm not sure how many Swahili people you have watching, but there's Brother Sid. Okay, there's an expression, and so it was my very first day learning Swahili. It was a kind of full immersion, where you just go into the classroom. It's one-on-one, and they just start speaking Swahili to you. And there's a very interesting, I would say, tradition in Kenya, where when you're coming into a room, you knock on the door and you say "Hodi," which basically means I'm not sure what it means, but it's basically "I'm here" or "let me in." And the response is "Karibu," which means welcome or you're welcome. Okay, that's the same "you're welcome" that you say if someone says thank you. So this young man who was my teacher knocked on the door of the classroom and said "Hodi." I had no idea what he was talking about. He said "Hodi" again. He said "Hodi" again, and then he motioned to me and said "Karibu." So I kind of understood that was the call and response. And he came in, I said "Karibu." And I thought that meant, because I had no context, I thought that meant, "Hello, how are you?" Or "How are you? I'm fine." I thought it was a greeting. So when I went back home to the Jesuit community that day, I was walking along the street and I said to everybody on the street, because you greet people, I'm not sure what it is like in Malaysia, but in Nairobi and in Kenya, if you pass someone in the street, you say hello. And I kept saying Hodi, which means, can I come in? And everyone started laughing at me, and I didn't understand what was wrong. And so I finally got up to our Jesuit community, and I saw the receptionist, who was Kenyan, and I said Hodi, and she just burst out laughing. She said, "You're already inside." So I think you have to laugh at yourself, because we can't take ourselves too seriously. And I'm sure Father Clarence, that in religious life and in the priesthood, there are a lot of people that take themselves way too seriously. We take God seriously. We take the gospel seriously. But even Jesus had a sense of humor. I talk about that in the book. So we need to really, as Chesterton said, the angels can fly because they don't take themselves too seriously.
Yeah, I think, the kind of work that we do, sometimes we need to laugh at ourselves and laugh at one another too. Especially when you live in a community, I think it's very important that you are able to take this in, and in a light way. And I think that in that book you bring out a lot of different stories, and I remember the different things and sometimes
and I'm sure you find that in the priesthood and in religious life, people I think, because they look up to priests, rightly or wrongly, the priest can get kind of an inflated image of himself. And
True.
The priest can really become, I think, a little vain and a little full of himself. There's a very funny story. I won't say who it is. It's a true story about a cardinal in the United States who was at a wedding. And I'm not sure if it's the same in Malaysia, but the culture here is that there's usually a head table, right? A head table. And that's where, the bride and the groom and maybe the mother of the bride and the groom's parents would sit. And there was a cardinal. This is a true story. There was a cardinal at a wedding, and he was mistakenly seated at table number 2 or 3. And the bride came up to him and said, "Your Eminence, I'm so sorry. You were supposed to be seated at the head table." And he said, "Wherever I am seated is the head table." And he wasn't being funny. He was serious. Right. And I just thought, this is a guy that really needs to laugh at himself a little bit more.
That's right. James, just coming into, the situation in Malaysia currently, we are still in a lockdown. And I know in the US, you have gone through the lockdown and you're kind of out of the lockdown at this time. I recall at least seeing an article that you wrote in the New York Times about where is God in this pandemic, in this crisis. I just want to kind of reflect with you also to help our listeners here. People keep asking the same question, where is God, in this pandemic? I just want to kind of relate it to a little bit about something that you wrote some years ago about your reflections on Ground Zero. Are people asking, do you see some similarities in the questions that people are asking? And what are your thoughts, after 1 year of this kind of lockdown? What are your reflections on where is God in all of this?
That's a great question. And, I've never been asked that question about pairing the two events. And I think they're very similar in that both events would seem like completely negative, right? Completely bad. Obviously, at Ground Zero, we had 3,000 people lose their lives. And, it was just a terrible, evil attack from terrorists, right? But when I was there, I was working at Ground Zero in the days and weeks afterwards. And I saw a great deal of the Holy Spirit, because I saw people who were being very generous. The rescue workers, of course, who had given their lives, right? There was that witness, right? Greater love has no man than the one who lays down his life for his friends. So there's that witness. But also people who had come from all over the country, all over the world to help. So there's this great sense of resurrection, in a sense. And I found God there. In the pandemic, also a different kind of evil, right? There's a kind of moral evil of the World Trade Center and a natural evil, right? Why do these natural disasters, in a sense, which is what the pandemic is, happen? But in any event, I think we can see God. I would write that article differently today. I would say that we can see God in the selflessness of hospital workers, for example, particularly at the beginning. And I'm sure in Malaysia, you had people going in not knowing, doctors and nurses and healthcare workers not knowing how infectious it was and not knowing how to treat these things, and real selflessness. And I would say also, Father, that God offers us two kinds of parables, right? A parable helps us understand how God is. In 9/11, I think the parable was God is like the firefighter who runs into the burning building to save you, right? There's this kind of great love. And I would say with the pandemic, God is like the doctor or the nurse that comes into your room to try to help you, even though, he or she is not sure that, they will be infected. So I think we see a great deal of love. And we've seen a lot of community too. I also think, what the Pope said is so appropriate, which is that we hope that we won't come out of this just going back to normal, right? We hope that we will see, our relationships differently. What do you think, Father? When you look at the pandemic, if someone said to you, where would God be in the midst of this? What would you say?
It's a very tough question for that. I think sometimes I also think that, at least I share this, having to console families who have lost a loved one. Those are the things I struggle with. Words sometimes don't make sense to them. I would admit that sometimes there's always this constant battle with God too. Why must this happen to someone like this? I had some friends who lost a sibling or a parent, but God is present. But I think for us at this time, he's still not very visible for people, especially who had really gone through some kind of a traumatic experience and still fighting with God. I mean, the questions that I'm asked, why is God punishing me? And that comes from somebody who's been in church, like a pillar of a church.
Well,
it's
the
best.
Yeah, it's a natural question, and I think, as you say, easy answers really don't help people.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there are a lot. I have a book called Learning to Pray that just came out, and I talk about unanswered prayers. And I think the sort of stereotypical easy answers like God is testing you, or which makes God seem to be a monster almost. I think the only real answer is the answer that you gave, which is that we don't know, right? That it is a mystery, right? That this is a mystery, and yet God is present to us. So the why, I think, is really a mystery, but that we do see signs of God's presence. And also, I like to remind people, without taking away their suffering, that Jesus would have lived in a time of pandemic too. And I mean, Jesus would have lived in a time when there wasn't modern medicine, and he's with us, and he has suffered with us, and he would have seen his friends get sick. And who knows, even St. Joseph may have died from some sort of illness like this. And so he's with us in our suffering. But I think you're right. I think there is no sort of satisfactory or sufficient answer to the question of why is there suffering. Yeah.
I mean, you also been kind of posting a little bit about what's happening in Haiti, and I guess it's also a situation where people are asking the same question. So it's all around the world. It's either a pandemic or some other kind of a natural disaster that takes place, and it's a constant question that people keep asking. I mean, coming from a Jesuit tradition, what does St. Ignatius say when dealing with suffering and pain?
Well, St. Ignatius, I think, would encourage us to place ourselves in the presence of God, and especially using our imaginations in an imaginative way, and place ourselves with Jesus, and ask to be led into a sort of conversation with Jesus in our prayer. I encourage people to talk to the Jesus who would have seen suffering, right? And also to talk to Jesus on the cross, because it is a kind of crucifixion for the world, really. Interestingly, Father, you were talking about I think the sort of comparison and the contrast between 9/11 and the pandemic is really a rich one, because I think you have, on the one hand, you have a moral evil, right? I'm not a moral theologian, but you have, that was the result of people's choices. I mean, people's evil choices, right? The terrorists driving the planes into the World Trade Center. Where the other is a natural evil, right? Illness, disease, cancer, a hurricane, earthquakes. And I would say that I think actually the moral evil is easier for people to grasp, because they say, all right, well, people made these bad decisions. I think the hard thing for people is the natural evil, which is, particularly kids getting sick and kids getting cancer and the pandemic. And it's very difficult to come up with satisfactory answers. But again, I think that the invitation really, I've been saying to people, is to still believe and trust in a God that we might not understand, right? That we still trust in this God. It's still about the relationship, even though we don't understand God's ways, which is something that's all over the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah. The other thing about during this pandemic, even we talk about the church, and one of the realities that we are dealing with here is, you have an on-site church, and now you have an online church, and ministry has changed. Even for us as priests, the ministry we had to kind of reinvent ourselves. Even this podcast is something that we kind of invented because we had to go online completely. And you being a consultor in the Dicastery for communications, how do you see post-pandemic? Do you see, this ministry, online ministry growing, or would we go back to that on-site kind of ministry?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure, but I'd be curious about your answers as well. I think it's going to be a both and. I think that people do really want to go back to church. The first time I went back, I celebrate Mass every day in my Jesuit community with my community, so I was very lucky. But the first time I went back to a public Mass, I live right next door to a church. I felt like it was a totally different experience, and it was. By the same token, I think that there are some things, for example, like this podcast and like educational things that I don't think are going to go away. I think people are more comfortable doing things online. So I think it will probably be some sort of hybrid, but I don't know. I do think, I don't know if this is controversial or not, I do think that the online masses, streaming masses, I think eventually people, they just want to get back to the pews and they want to sing. I tell you, the first time I heard an organ in church, I thought, oh my gosh, I've really been missing this. So I think there's some things that we can learn and we can keep, but I do think there's no substitute for in person. What do you think? Do you think that this online ministry will continue in the church?
I would think, like you said, a hybrid model. A lot of people are getting comfortable also, and I think one of the questions that is in the minds of church leaders, that would people come back? Would people come back? We don't know. Some research or some surveys show that people will come back. More people will come back. I think there was a survey done in the UK, and they saw more people returning after the pandemic to church. Maybe a greater reliance on God for.
You mean more than before? More than before the pandemic?
More than before.
Yeah. We'll see. That's like at 9/11. There was a big spike. People went back to church, and then it went back down. I tell you, here's a funny thing that I've heard from a number of people. Without saying where this is, but in the United States, many people, as you know, are not, in a sense, restricted to the parishes they will go to online, right? And so let's say most people go to their local parish, but people online, they've been, sampling everywhere, many parishes. And I know people, which is, I think will be kind of a challenge. I know people who have said, gee, the preaching at this online parish is so much better than my local parish, or the music is so much better, or the liturgy is better. Why can't my parish be like this? So I think the challenge is going to be that also people have gotten used to a certain, level of liturgy. And if they don't find it in their local parish, I think that's kind of a challenge. It may be a good challenge for the parishes to kind of compare with one another. But I've heard that as well. I like my online Mass of this parish, thousands of miles away than I do my local parish. So it's kind of a challenge.
Well, I would assume you and I come from a similar generation, but with the millennials who are so tech savvy and who are so born into this digital world, do you think that there's something that they would embrace more openly, kind of an online ministry?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. I think they're more comfortable with it and they're more adept at it. I do think, though, a big word for millennials and Gen Z is the word community. And they are looking for, a real community. And I think that even, I was going to say kids, but even young people that age, are looking for one-on-one in-person relationships. But I think you're right. I think that the bar is a lot lower, and they're a lot more comfortable doing things online. So it's I think one of the benefits for a lot of people has been, especially for the elderly, who can't, go to church. I think that's been a real blessing. So a lot of elderly people who physically were not able to go to church even before the pandemic, now they have a place that they can go. I know my mother, for example, who lives in Philadelphia, she watches Cardinal Dolan's Mass at the Cathedral of St. Patrick's in New York City every Sunday, and loves Cardinal Dolan now. And she obviously wouldn't be able to travel to New York every Sunday, so it's been a big blessing for her. Now, are you doing masses online, Father, yourself?
Personally, I was doing in the first lockdown, but currently no. In the first lockdown, because it was a strict lockdown, so we kind of took turns to do the online masses. But now we are kind of designated some parishes to do online masses for the Archdiocese. Are you all back to church? I mean, are people back to church in New York?
Yes, I would say probably about 4 or 5 months ago, when the vaccines started to come here. I have a bad sense of time, but I would say maybe March and April, the vaccines started to come. And as I said, I live right next door to a parish, and we are back in church, but everyone usually is wearing a mask.
Okay.
And that's never changed, and that's been fine. It almost changes day by day. This Delta variant has made people more worried, but I would say, my neighborhood, I live on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, and believe it or not, my neighborhood is 97% vaccinated. And so, one feels pretty safe here. One of the reasons, I think, is that we were particularly hard hit at the beginning. I live right, I can see through my window. I'm not going to turn the camera, but through my window, I can see a hospital where people were being taken. So, I think that's a very strong motivation for people to get vaccinated. But we're back, and there are even choirs where they with masks. It's so yeah. But in Kuala Lumpur, you said that it's kind of a mix. Some churches are back and some are not.
No, but I mean, not everyone is back. I mean, it's just. We are live streaming masses from some parishes, and those who are involved in the live streaming, they get to go, but not the general population, the general public, still not able to go to mass. We haven't reached that level of immunity yet in the community. So hopefully soon. We're hoping that by this Christmas we get to go to mass.
I hope so.
For most people. Father James, I want to come to something that was all over the media. You meeting the Holy Father. I think it was in June, somewhere in June. You had met the Holy Father, Pope Francis. The work that you do online, of course, you have received quite a bit of flack from a lot of people. But you met the Holy Father, and there's a letter also that he writes. Which I will ask you a little bit in a short while.
Sure.
Have you met him before? I mean, prior to this, as a Jesuit?
No.
This is the first time.
No, what happened was, it was actually it was 2 years ago, in 2019. I was over there for one of these meetings for the Dicastery for Communication, and I just have to say, because I am not a Jesuit provincial, meaning a regional superior or a college president or anything special like that, and I don't have any special office in the Jesuits, I'm not in Rome much. But when I was invited to participate in this dicastery, there was a big meeting for the whole dicastery. So I went over. I stayed at the Jesuit Curia, and a friend of mine, who's a friend of the Pope, a close friend of the Pope, said, "Would you like to meet the Pope?" And I said, "Of course." I said, as long as he would want to meet me. And I won't tell you the whole story, but I was in this audience with him, and they said, "He wants to meet you." And I went up and I introduced myself in Spanish. I said, "I'm James Martin." And he said, "Oh, I'd like to have an audience with you." And I went to his assistant, who was standing right next to him, and they said, "What's your phone number?" And I thought, "Oh boy, this is never going to happen." But sure enough, 2 days later, an invitation arrives at the Jesuit Curia. I have to say, that was probably one of the most exciting days of my life. And then sure enough, that next Monday, it was September 30th, 2019, I met with him for a half an hour. I really do think it was one of the highlights of my entire life. And he asked me not to divulge too much of what we talked about, but I can say we talked about my ministry with LGBTQ Catholics. And it was just fantastic. And then in June of this year, so I've gotten to be, I'll say, in touch with him. And I was running an online conference for LGBTQ Catholics and those who minister with them. And I want to say for our audience, this is not challenging in any church teaching. It's just sort of outreach. And I said to him, if you'd like to send a greeting. And he sent me this beautiful note, handwritten note. And I checked with a couple people who said that, he's leaving it up to you if you want to share it. And it was a beautiful note about God's way of love is with closeness, compassion, and tenderness. He said he prays for my flock, meaning the LGBTQ community.
I think we have a visual. We have a visual of that letter, that handwritten letter.
Yeah, it was there. It is. Yeah, so it's in Spanish.
He writes to you in Spanish.
It's in Spanish, and I write to him in Spanish. I have to have it translated. I'll move over here. I won't translate the whole thing, but there you go.
That's right.
The beautiful thing I love is in the second paragraph, he praises my own ministry, which was lovely. But then he talks about, I'll read it. Our Heavenly Father comes close with love to each one of his children, each and every one. His heart is open to each and every one. He is a father. God's style, I love this, has 3 elements: closeness, compassion, and tenderness. This is how he comes closer to each one of us. And then he talks a little bit about my ministry. And then in the next paragraph, I pray for your faithful, your flock, and all those whom the Lord places in your care, so that you protect them, make them grow in the love of our Lord Jesus Christ. And, I have to say, I do get a lot of flack, but in that paragraph before that, he says, I pray for you to continue in this way. And one of the things I say to people who might have problems with some of my ministry is that, I've been asked by the Pope to continue, and he's my superior, and that's what I'm going to do. But it was a great note, and it wasn't just for me; it was for all LGBTQ people, and it was really exciting. And that's
and here is
that's
so you have this as on your Facebook
I do.
Picture. It must have been a very significant moment for you to meet him face to face like this.
I honestly, Father Clarence, I couldn't believe I was in there. I couldn't believe it. And yet I have to tell you, look, I want to make these things clear, because sometimes people have strange ideas about Jesuits. That's the first time I met him. I shook his hand once or twice, but that's the first time I've ever had a conversation with the Pope. And a couple of things. He was very warm and open and very attentive, funny, laughing. Sometimes when you see him at masses, he looks very serious. That's his sort of mass face, right? Very serious. But in person, he's very open, very warm. And I will say that I was completely relaxed when I was with him, which was surprising. And I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. First of all, I just went in to kind of be the voice of LGBTQ people. I wasn't there to convince him of anything, right? So there wasn't, I didn't feel pressure in that sense. I knew that I was there to just be these people's voices, but also he's very warm. It just felt like being with a brother Jesuit. And I felt
what was the room? What was the room? Was it his library?
That's the library in the Apostolic Palace. And,
all right.
That's where he meets. I was really honored. That's where he meets diplomats and presidents. And one of the ways that the Vatican works also is, where you meet with them, whether or not you're on his schedule, whether or not they send out a picture, that's a sign of, in a sense, his approval. And I can't say enough about it. I felt, I haven't shared this with too many people, but the expression walking on air, that expression.
Yeah.
When you're happy, you're walking on air.
That's right.
I truly, I haven't shared this with too many people. I actually felt when I was leaving the office that I was lighter. I actually felt like, I thought, oh my gosh, this is probably what that means. I felt lighter and uplifted and really inspired. Can I tell you another funny story? Sure. You can see in that picture of the two of us meeting, I'm reaching into my pocket, and you can see that right there. I didn't realize that when you have these formal pictures taken, you're supposed to be still. They're like formal pictures, but I'm reaching in my pocket. I'm pulling out a letter from my nephew, who was going to take the name Francis. And he's writing. He wrote to the Pope in Spanish and said he'd like to take the name Francis for confirmation. And the Pope said, "Would you like me to write him a letter back?" And he did, on the spot. And I guess 2 months ago, my nephew finally had his confirmation, which was delayed for 2 years because of COVID. And he took the name Francis, and he wore socks with the picture of Pope Francis on it. And I sent him a picture. And so the first part of the letter from Pope Francis
I was wondering what the reference was to the socks.
Yeah. So if you look at that letter, the first part of the letter says, I want to thank you for the picture of your nephew.
That's right.
And congratulate him. There you go. Please thank your nephew for his kindness to me and for having chosen the name Francisco, and congratulate him on the socks. That made me laugh. Tell him I pray for him, and please ask him to do so for me. So he wore socks with a picture of Pope Francis on them for his confirmation. Wow. So here's the point. You were saying this earlier, Father, to have a sense of humor. I mean, Pope Francis said that seeing my nephew with socks with his photo on it made him laugh. And I think that's great to actually have that in the same letter where he's talking about, ministering to LGBTQ people. It just shows you that that's part of who he is, and that's part of who we are.
No, you always think when you write letters to celebrities and famous people, it's their PA, their personal assistant, who will pick up those letters and not pass it on. It's interesting that he actually picks it up, he reads it, and he replies, making reference to it in his busy schedule. I wonder how he really does it. It's amazing.
I don't know how he does it either. And one of the things that I thought was, after my nephew, it's a very funny picture. I might be able to find it for you while we're talking. I don't want to take up too much time, but when I got the picture of my nephew, I took it myself when he was being confirmed. I laughed so hard, and I remember thinking, I should really. Oh, here it is. Here's the picture. It's very funny. I'm sure you can see it. See him?
All right. Okay.
And there he is with the socks. You see the socks?
Yes.
With Pope Francis. And I said to myself, I have to send this to the Pope. And Father Clarence, I thought, he has such a busy life.
He's
probably so stressed. I think this will make him laugh. And I wanted to send it just because I knew it would make him laugh. And I told him that story a couple of years ago. And it did. So I was happy I sent it. And I think we all need a laugh. And I think he needed a break, from a lot of the stress in his job. And you're right. I don't know how he responds to all of the letters. I don't know how he does it.
It's amazing.
It is.
We're talking about receiving flag, Father James, and you receive a lot for what you do in ministries that you do. I just trying to, as a fellow priest, I'm trying to understand, how do you cope with this? Do you bring this to the Lord in prayer? And sometimes it can be very, very energy draining. Do you feel like that? Yeah.
Well, we're going to shift gears a little bit because it's going to get a little more serious. Yeah. So for people who don't know, I work with the LGBTQ community, and I really am attacked pretty much daily online. And so basically, Father, about 5 or 6 years ago on retreat, my annual retreat, I'm going in a couple days to the same place. I was praying with the story of the rejection at Nazareth. And for those of you who don't know, the rejection at Nazareth is when Jesus stands up in the synagogue in Nazareth and essentially proclaims that he's the Messiah, more or less. And the people initially like him, but then they turn on him. And then we Catholics tend to downplay this, but they drive him to the brow of a hill and they try to kill him. So they try to throw him off a hill. The people in Nazareth try to throw Jesus off a hill and kill him. And in my prayer, Ignatius asks us to imagine ourselves in prayer with, in these gospel scenes. I remember saying to Jesus, well, you knew all these people in your town, right? I mean, we know Nazareth was 200 to 400 people. It's very small. It's a small town. How were you able to do this? Like, how were you able to stand up and do this knowing that people would probably reject you? And the words I heard in prayer, and I don't mean actually heard them, but that came to me, was Jesus saying to me, must everyone like you? And it was quite shocking, Father. I didn't expect something like that. It seemed very mysterious, but I realized that Jesus was free of the need to be loved, liked, or approved of, right? He didn't need people's approval in Nazareth for him to do his job. And early on, even his family, we know in Mark 3:21, his family comes to Capernaum to restrain or arrest him. They don't understand him at that point. And he doesn't need that. And I felt it was an invitation for me to let go of that need for everyone to like me. So that's the first thing. And when the attacks came, I went back to that invitation to freedom, right? And look, you have a beautiful picture of Jesus behind you in that icon. People did this to Jesus, so why would we expect them to do any different to us, right? He says that in the Gospels. But eventually, I also realized that I can say this now publicly because of that letter. I have the support of the Pope, who you saw said, continue with this work. I have the support of my Jesuit superiors, and so I feel comfortable in it. And I also know that I'm not challenging any church teaching. I'm basically just asking people to listen to LGBTQ people and love them and treat them, as the Pope said, it's so beautiful, with compassion, closeness, and tenderness, right? So gradually, believe it or not, the attacks stopped really bothering me. And also, we have to say that, some of these things online, I mean, if it's some anonymous Twitter account with, 2 followers and it's anonymous and it's been clearly set up just to attack me, why would I take that seriously? So it can be difficult at times, especially if it comes out of the blue. But I for the most part, I try not to pay too much attention to it. And I think of that phrase that from my retreat, must everyone like you? Not everyone's going to like me. And I always say as a joke to people, they didn't like Jesus. A lot of people didn't like Jesus, and he was a pretty nice guy, right? So why would we expect any different?
You talk about taking things to prayer, and in your most recent book about learning to pray, there's one thing that kind of caught my attention. You talk about prayer as God's desire to be in a relationship with us. Very often we think of prayer as, I want to be in a relationship with God. We don't see it, Would you like to explain that a little bit further? I mean,
of course. Yeah. So we all, I think everyone kind of on this podcast, certainly the podcast, the subject is finding God in all things. We all, if we sort of look carefully enough, have a desire to encounter God. Now, what does that mean? You might have a longing to for more in your life. Is that all there is? There's a sort of, as St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So we have a desire. Or we have a desire for a more spiritual life, a more prayerful life. We're desire to know God more, desire to encounter God more in prayer. And I always ask people, where do you think that desire comes from? Some people say, well, I'm just curious, or I'm worried, or I see someone who seems to have a more spiritual life and they seem more calm. But you have to say that desire that is really coming from God, because that's the way that God draws you. How else would God draw you other than by planting within you the desire for God, right? So I saw a plaque in a retreat house in New Jersey a couple of years ago, which I love, which was, that which you seek is seeking you. And the beginning of the spiritual life, I think, is for people to recognize that the desire that they have for God is really God's desire for them. This is the way how else would God call us? This is the way God calls us. And so it can be very profound for people to recognize that, because then it becomes less of I am just curious, right? You know what I mean? Like, I'm just curious, versus God is calling me. It demands a yes. So I found that really helpful in the spiritual life. God's desire for us. That's the theme of the whole Old Testament. The whole Old Testament is God's desire for people of Israel. And then obviously God desires us so much and wants to be with us so much, he becomes one of us, right? It's just extraordinary. And then the Holy Spirit, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful insight that I continually go back to.
You also talk in your book about the Jesuits' guide to everything, almost, a spirituality of everything. For a lot of people, at least to our listeners, who at this time, when we are far away from church, we are far away from, far in the sense it's not accessible at this time to the sacraments. What would you say? How would people pray during this time? Would you have some simple tips? What can you do from home? We say learning to pray.
Well, my joke would be, you can buy the book and find out all the different ways of prayer. But seriously, there are so many different methods and techniques of prayer. There's the technique I've been sort of alluding to throughout this podcast, which is Ignatian contemplation, where you imagine yourself in a scripture scene, which can be very helpful for people and just to see what comes up. And by what comes up, I mean things like emotions, memories, feelings, desires, insights, words and phrases, all the kinds of things that come up in our prayer experience, or can come up. That doesn't mean they always come up in our prayer. I think one of the most helpful ways during the pandemic is a prayer called the examination of conscience, which is a very popular Jesuit prayer, which is essentially, I won't go through the whole thing, but it's essentially a review of the day. You sit down for 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes at the end of the day, and you review where you feel God has been. And why do you need to do that? Well, because in the middle of a pandemic, particularly when things really can seem bleak, to be able to see where God has been active, in a phone call from a friend, a text, a podcast that you might have seen on YouTube, right? Like this one, something you read in a book, a doctor helps you, a pharmacist helps you, you go out and you see the sunshine, you're working in your garden. To be able to sort of look back and see those moments really helps put things in perspective. And it does help you find God in all things. Again, coming back to that Ignatian phrase, because, as we know, when we are very upset, we tend to go to the negative, But I would say, what do you think, Father? What have you, when I'm sure people have asked you, what
one of the things that, yeah, I mean, one of the things that sometimes I too forget. Recently, I was reminded, I was just kind of like, this whole thing is kind of, after a while, after 18 months of sitting in kind of a lockdown, it gets to you, even to the best of anyone.
Absolutely.
And I was just saying, oh my goodness, I really can't wait. And then this person just told me this, Father, don't forget gratitude, for what you have. I think it's a very good reminder to me, in fact, to say that, yeah, there's so many things that, that are not going right, but don't forget there are many things that are going right too. That's and like you said, I mean, you look out the window, you see sunshine, or you look at other people, you look at other things. So that's what I've been telling people recently, after being reminded. I think it was God's way of telling me too, don't forget to be grateful for the things that you get, gratitude. So that's been my prayer, in this last couple of months, trying to put out, as you said, there's a lot of negative energy that sometimes drains you, and just to look at there's so many things to be thankful for, God.
Yeah. And I also think that for me, I'll tell you something that I've kind of boiled it all down. Because people, you're saying, Father, that, it can be stressful, and we can say, I can't deal with it anymore, or this is never going to change, or I can't. And I always tell people that the shorthand way for discernment is that despair and panic are never coming from God. Hope and courage always are. And so if you feel within yourself this voice, in a sense, not physical voices, but this kind of impulse towards despair, to not listen to it. But if there are impulses towards hope, and yes, I can get through this, yes, I have resources, yes, I'm able to get through this, that's coming from God. Because this is Jesus's message in the Gospels always. How many times does he say, fear not? And so that's a nice way to discern. And I found that helpful for people in the last 18 months.
Yeah. As we come out slowly, I mean, you have, I think you are a lot of steps ahead of us in terms of going back to church and being sacraments being accessible to many people. I think as we come out of this pandemic, I was just going to ask you, are there things that the church has to learn from this experience as we move out, and what would you say things like, what would be like some of the priorities that we need to put in place, that we should have and must have learned from this pandemic for us to move forward?
Wow, that's such a good question. I'd be curious about your answers to that too. I think that the primary thing may be how much people have suffered and how much people need consolation, and how much people need the church to be, in a sense, the church, Pope Francis's image is the church as the field hospital. And I know oftentimes, without getting into anything sort of controversial, that the church can sometimes focus on what we call hot button issues, right? These real hot button topics. And I think most people right now just need to be comforted and just need to have the church as their home. Welcome back. And, depends on where this is, but, sometimes the church doesn't do that very well, right? I mean, sometimes what people hear from church leaders is mostly condemnations and documents versus when they really need to just be comforted. And, people who have lost their jobs and have lost loved ones, as you were saying. So I would hope that the church could be a consoler, really, and that the church would see that as its primary mission in the next few years, really, because it's going to be taking a while to get over this. What would you say? I mean, I'm always loath to say what the church should do, but what would you say, Father?
No, I agree totally with you. I think as we come out of this, people are broken. I mean, in terms of their relationship with God, in terms of relationship within the families. I mean, we also hear of, within problems in families, broken marriages because of, having to live in the same house, and,
Yes.
and you're really having to confront each other, so many different issues. You said having lost a loved one, and I totally agree with you. I think I like the word you use, the church as a consoler. To be able to be with people. My fear is that we want to go back to the pre-pandemic days as quickly as possible, and we would not have learned anything through the pandemic then, because we want things to happen as how it was before. Maybe because we are used to that model. We are used to how things are done that particular way. Okay, you do the mass is celebrated this way, and you do this thing this way, and you don't change. But perhaps I think for all of us, I think it's a time to kind of relook and prioritize our ministry.
I agree. I mean, if you think of imagine someone having gone through a terrible health crisis and then having buried a loved one, and you see that person at work or on the street on the next day or the next week, you would never just pretend that everything was fine. You would really spend some time with that person and also give that person some time. But again, I think that, oftentimes the church and church leaders are so focused on discipline and rules and condemnations and, as I said, hot button topics, that they forget that that's not what people may need. I mean, obviously the church is a teacher, but the church as consoler, I think, is really an important role for us. The church is pastor. So yeah, I would hope that we would learn from that. But again, I'm always loath to say what the church should do and shouldn't do.
One of the things is you talk about church as consoler, church as healer. These are the models. One of the things, as you were saying, that came to my mind was that walk that Pope Francis made, to pray for Rome, that in solitude. Sometimes I think, the kind of reforms that Pope Francis is trying to bring to the church, sometimes it seems as though like he's in a solitude also. He's alone.
Yeah, he gets attacked too. And I'm just always stunned. I am always stunned by that, because he's not changed any church teaching. He's continuing with St. John Paul and Pope Emeritus Benedict. And the other thing that strikes me, and I won't get into this too much, but I couldn't imagine some of the critiques, even from cardinals and bishops, that happened to Francis happening in any way, shape, or form under John Paul or Benedict. It's just stunning to me how much antipathy there is. But, Pope Francis continues to do what he needs to do. And he's also free. He's a very free man. And I just pray that he continues and that he has the strength to continue. And I think he's our model in all of this, and that kind of what we in the Jesuits call indifference or detachment. But I think he really understands the pandemic very well. He has that book, Let Us Dream, where he talks about not going back to things as normal, right? Not going back to the way things were, and to really, to take stock and to see this as an important turning point for humanity.
Yeah. Brother James, I asked 1 hour of you, and we have come to an hour almost for this conversation. Just before we go, before I let you go to do your other things, in your book about the Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, in terms of a spirituality for real life, you kind of break down things very simply. Just coming back to the question, or at least the theme of the podcast, finding God in all things. What would you say to our listeners here? How do we find God in the ordinariness of human life? Sometimes we want to look for God in extraordinary situations.
Yeah.
We want everything. We want a sacred space. We want a a sacred music behind you.
Right.
But
Right.
but how do we find God in daily life?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right. We all do, right? Who wouldn't want, like the transfiguration to make things clear? Although even at the transfiguration, Peter, James, and John, they were a little overwhelmed. You're right. And I think finding out in all things means it's not just in church. It's not just in church. It's not just when you're reading your scriptures. It's not just in the sacraments, which are all, key ways of finding God. It's with your children. It's with your spouse. It's walking out in the street. It's getting a funny text message from a friend. It's having a good meal, right? Finding out in all things means that every moment is an opportunity to encounter God. And I think the key to your question is noticing. Is noticing where God is paying attention. Most of prayer and most of the spiritual life is noticing these things. But if we overlook them, if we sort of pass them by, if we don't notice, we're not attentive, we can miss them. And so a lot of it's noticing and also being aware and accepting the fact that this is in fact God. So it doesn't have to be something, as you say, with, religious music and a big sunbeam. But it could be something very simple. It could be like a little, your child or your grandchild smiling at you or laughing, or the sound of a child's laugh, right? That's enough, right? If that's a way that you can experience God's grace, that's enough. And so part of it is noticing. So I think half of the spiritual life is noticing.
Father James, you have covered a lot of things, and you have written about a lot of things, about humor, your reflections on ground zero, where is God in all of this, your experience in the refugee camps, your encounter with Christ. I remember there's this book about Jesus Christ, A Journey, and that's a very powerful book.
Thank you.
I just want to ask, this may be my last question, and then I'll let you go to do other things. While writing that book, at the end of it all, I don't know whether I'm going to phrase it correctly, but in the sense that, what kind of a Jesus did you encounter at the end of it all?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question.
Did you start with a kind of a thing, and then did you end it differently?
It's a great question. So the book Jesus, a Pilgrimage, is the story of it's a life of Christ, but it's also the story of a pilgrimage I took through the Holy Land and my own encounters with Jesus. I would say that I know that we all believe Jesus is fully human and fully divine. We say that every Sunday. I believe that, but I think my travels to the Holy Land really helped me encounter the human side of Jesus even more. I will say that, and I say this in the book. Have you been to the Holy Land, Father? Or
yes, twice.
Yeah, there you go. So I think that there's something extraordinary about standing where Jesus stood and knowing that he saw the same things that you're seeing. And we can be sure. I always tell the pilgrims, there may be many different places where this miracle or that miracle happened, but there are some places that we know this is the Sea of Galilee, right? There's no other Sea of Galilee.
That's
this
right.
is it. He would have seen this. And it grounds Jesus, and it grounds him in a particular place in a particular time in a way that just really overwhelmed me. So I think the humanity of Jesus really came through for me on that trip. And that's what I try to communicate in the book. So for example, and I think it's an invitation, that the humanity of Jesus is an invitation for us to think about the kinds of things that he would have encountered. So again, to bring it back to the pandemic, that he would have encountered sickness. And I don't mean just the people he healed, right? He obviously healed those, not everyone though. Meaning he didn't heal every single person in Judea and in Galilee, but he would have known sickness, and he would have known people who were sick in his life. And to really understand that as that's the person that we're in a relationship with. So that Jesus understands all things, understands us not simply because he's divine and understands everything, right? But because he's human and he experienced all things. So the one who experienced everything is just such a powerful model for me. And I'm even getting tongue-tied talking about what it's like to be in the Holy Land. I'm sure your experiences were the same. It's extraordinary to say he was here.
True. I mean, one of the things, just to conclude, one of the things that I kind of experience the Holy Land is that the Bible comes alive.
Yes.
Every Sunday or every day when you read the Gospel, they say, "Hey, I was there. I saw this." And it becomes very personal in that sense. Quite different from if I had not been to the Holy Land. It was just I would just have to imagine how things were. But then the Bible comes alive, like you said, the humanity of Christ.
And also you just see where so many of his parables come from. I'll tell you a very quick story in a place called the Bay of Parables, which is most likely where he preached the parable of the seed, right? The sower that goes out to sow. And you remember in the parable, it falls on rocky ground, it falls on fertile ground, and it falls among thorn bushes. And in that place, we can be sure that it's near here, right? The Sea of Galilee in that area is very, small, the shoreline. In that place when we were there were rocky ground, fertile ground, and big thorn bushes. And you realize that when he's talking to people about nature and everyday life in the parables, he's picking things right where they were. And it just makes it come alive in a new way. And you say, aha, now I get it. Or when you go from Jerusalem to Jericho, which is the scene of the Good Samaritan, a man went down to Jericho, the Jericho Road, and you see how many twists and turns there are and how hilly it is and where robbers would be able to hide, you realize, okay, this is a dangerous road. This is why this man is beaten. And you get it. You say, okay, now I understand it. And things that might not have made sense or might seem a little mysterious or strange, once you're there, you say, now I get it. I know exactly what he's talking about. So
very true. Father James, we could go on talking. I know I need to let you go. You need to get your weekly reflections out very quickly. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, meeting you, and I've read about you, and finally, to have this conversation with you. Thank you very much for your time, for sharing your experience, your wisdom with us, your ministry, your encounter with the Holy Father, and so many other things. I hope you've had a good time talking to us too. And hopefully we can welcome you in Malaysia in the route of your father.
I love, that's right, in the footsteps of my father. I would love to. I just want to thank you, Father Clarence. You're obviously a great priest, and I could talk to you for the next couple of hours and would probably love to. But I just want to say thanks for inviting me on your wonderful podcast. And please keep me in your prayers, and I will certainly be praying for you.
Thank you very much. And so there we had a conversation. I had a conversation with Father James Martin. Such an interesting conversation with him, who's doing so many different things, and he writes a lot about spirituality, about our lives and our encounters with God. Hope you have had a good podcast. After talking to him, I'm tongue-tied already. To be able to share this with you, and we look forward to seeing you again next week, same time, Saturday morning, 10:30 a.m. Bye, everyone.